Major support for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The term and concept economic mobility is used a lot interchangeably with economic opportunity these days. But what does it mean really, and how is it different from what has been traditionally referred to and historically referred to as social welfare initiatives? Welcome again to the longest running and the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy dialogue right here in the Carolinas. In a moment, with our expert panel, we will attempt to tease out how this community-wide effort, or I should say communities-wide effort, may be different. And more importantly, what is the best way forward for success and fairness for everyone?
Gratefully acknowledging support by Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Barings, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Tricia Richardson from SC Thrive, Karen Kedrowski of Winthrop University, Sue Cole from Sage Leadership and Strategy, and James Ford of the Leading on Opportunity Council.
Hello, welcome to our program. Let's talk about this idea of economic mobility, economic opportunity. Tricia, you get the first pitch here. How do we define that now? And how is it, I'm sorry to ask this question so long, but how is it now, and how is it different than social welfare initiatives that we've known for so long?
You know, I think it's a packaging term now as opposed to individual social welfare programs. What we've done with SC Thrive is try to put it in bundle the services to take away some of the barriers to all of the things that people need to get done over the course of a day or a decade or a year, be it education, be it getting access to the resources they need, be it the job skills training that they need. So for me, it's a packaging at the local level, because I really work at the grassroots level across the state in South Carolina, but we have a partner here in North Carolina, being MDC, has done this work here for about 5 years as well.
Yeah, James, what do you think? How's it different?
Yeah, you know, I think to put it simply, I think economic mobility is the ability for a person to improve their financial situation, right, to use layman terms. And what that means, of course, is there's lots of abilities or opportunities to do that via education, via social capital, human capital. And when those things aren't available, what you find is that people are entrenched in very segregated, very racialized pockets where they can't move upward, and that becomes problematic for a community when you can't mobilize whole sectors into opportunity.
Is economic opportunity and mobility, is this, it almost minimizes it, and I don't want to marginalize it or minimize it the way it is now. But Karen, let's start with you. You head the Civic Leadership Center down in Winthrop. How does this come up in dialogues about what economic opportunity and mobility means?
Well, it comes up often in the context of job training, and there's a lot of disagreement about exactly what that should be. So one of the current debates facing higher education, especially with the four-year colleges and universities, is whether or not the traditional liberal arts actually train people for jobs, or if the soft skills that liberal arts are so good at training students to do actually are more effective in terms of converting them to the workplace. I think another dimension of it, though, has to do with the focus on the two-year technical and community colleges, which often are really very vocationally focused, and we certainly need trained welders and truck drivers and dental hygienists and individuals like that in society. But where we see a way to break the lock on intergenerational poverty is by getting people into educational programs, getting them skills, and knowledge, whether they're hard skills or soft skills, and then helping them to succeed in the workplace.
So, James talked about something. Tricia, you talked about, kind of grassroots. James talked about education to some degree. Sue, if we go to the genesis of the issue of economic mobility, is there, I don't want to overly simplify it, but is there one thing that we could do that would help, not down the line in education, while that's important, but is there one thing we can do early in the timeline of a family or a person that helps change the arc of economic mobility?
I believe there is, and I think it starts with the involving at least two generations, the parents and the children. And if we can get parents talking to young children to develop that vocabulary, if we can get them involved in good, excellent preschool programs, if we can start when that child is very young and we can teach parents how to be good parents, then I think that's helping at a grassroots level. And I might add, we started something in Greensboro through our United Way program called the Family Success Center, and that's exactly what we do. We work with both generations. We integrate the services so that child care is provided while the parent is receiving the job skills that you talked about, Karen.
I feel you nodding back here.
Yeah. The only reason I might disagree is because I don't think there's one particular thing, right? But I feel like obviously pre-K access is huge because when you don't get that, students come to class with gaps, and those gaps persist and widen over time. I would add as a caveat, I think housing is a huge piece of that because you can break down where economic opportunity lies by zip code. So where you live at has a huge bearing on your access to pre-K, on your access to quality schools. It has a correlation to access to health care and food security, all these other things that are the tentacles of economic mobility that we often don't look at, but have a huge bearing on the outcomes for children as they matriculate into adulthood.
What about the family? What about the family unit as some kind of centralized, not solution, but certainly important to this dialogue?
I think the family unit can look different. You have a lot of single moms out there, and if you don't have families around, having that support system, because your child also can then maybe go to daycare for a while, and having that transition from, can I pick up my child from work today? Am I putting them in a good daycare? Have we trained the skills for these daycare workers? But having that support system around the family, whether that's a nuclear unit or broad-based, whatever that looks like. I was a single parent when I had my first child, and my network wasn't just my parents. I needed that broader network to do all the things I needed to do to keep my child where I needed her to be.
2 points. One is I agree completely with Sue's point that you need to work with multiple generations.
Absolutely.
And I would say that you need to bring in grandparents or the grandparents' generation, aunts and uncles as well, because very often they end up as caregivers of young children while the parent, often a single parent, might be off at work. So we need to get those people involved in reading to children, encouraging them to do homework, making sure that they get a meal at night, all of those important things. And then secondly, I think James is exactly right in terms of the zip code being determinative. And we often think about that as blighted inner cities, and that's important. But in South Carolina, some of our most intractable poverty is in rural areas.
Absolutely.
And we need to work on economic development because and job training in those regions, and how to bring those services and those opportunities to the people who live there. Because for them to be able, travel can be a huge barrier for them to be able to get out of those small towns and find a place where they can go to school and find a place where they can get a job.
Before we get to the rural-urban divide, I think that's important. James, I want to be careful. This is not patronizing, but you grew up obviously African-American. Is there a culture?
I know, still in.
I know I didn't. I can confirm that. I still am. What is the culture like in the African-American community about family, about fathers either being there or not being there?
Right.
And how does that play into this? And when you lead an effort that Charlotte has going on, how does that, is there not, I want to be, and I know you're going to be good about this, but I don't want it to turn into, as you use the term segregation and racial, I don't want it to be that kind of answer or dialogue, but how can we make sure that we bring people to the table about the family unit?
Right. So one of the things I think is looking at the root causes historically of what is created a divide in family, right? I know Moynihan attempted to do that, right, in the 60s, and I think a lot of what he diagnosed was somewhat accurate. But the thing is, the other thing is that non-traditional families across the board have increased, right? And so, whereas you may have a single mother, what oftentimes is not being seen as there is co-parenting, so they might not be living in the same house, but the African-American father actually is quite involved, even if he's not under the same roof. And so, there's a changing dynamic of what family is and what that looks like. And it is a wide range right across the board. Obviously, the rates of single-parent household is extremely high, or much higher in the African-American community. But I think the point at which the black household was at the time of Moynihan, I think the white community is there as well. So non-traditional families and what those look like and how they exist in those environments is something we have to look at writ large, because the black community is not a monolith. I was raised with two parents, but I have plenty of folks who weren't, and levels of success vary. So
Sue, with the work that you've done around the state over the years, philanthropically, charitably, what do you, with these single mothers that are now more the rule than they are the exception, do these households even I mean, it's not fair to say, but do they even have the resources and the time? Do these single moms, and maybe single dads, do they have the opportunity to even understand where they are and to find the resources that they need to help this family survive and thrive so they can become mobile?
Some do, of course, but I would say most do not. And we do
Most do not?
I believe most do not understand where the resources are, and we have to educate them on what's available. We have to give them opportunity. And in the workplace, I think we have got to move to a more flexible workplace. I love millennials, to look at age for just a minute. I am so fond of the millennials, and I know that some are not. But I believe they are going to help us figure out the workplace, to give the workplace employers more chances to be flexible in how people work.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, who's doing that well? What employer out there has really nailed this? Do you have any example?
I think that some of the banks are. My daughter works for Marriott, and they do it really, really well. They give smart, educated women a chance to be moms and work.
Tricia, you said you did it. You single mom. How did you do it?
Well, I had a couple jobs there for a while because you got to make ends meet, but I had family and friends, and so what I did is I partnered up with another mother. She was going to school at night, so the 2 nights that she went to school, I watched her children, and the 2 nights that I needed to train at night or work at night, she was able to watch my daughter for me. So it worked. You partner, you find ways to do it. I didn't want my parents to watch her all the time because I wanted them to have a grandparent relationship with her. And my husband had the same issue. He was a single parent of 2, and he was more frustrated that there weren't enough fathers or things for fathers out there that he could move forward. And neither one of us really knew what resources were available to us. That's why I'm so passionate about making sure people know that there are resources available. Maybe not enough, but there are resources available, and more than we probably know about.
Does the educational, and I'm looking at you, Professor Kedrowski, the educational component, the folks that we talk about that are at risk in this economic opportunity and economic mobility can't even think K through 12, let alone get to a 4-year degree. So is this forcing the way we think about education past primary school?
Oh, absolutely.
So how is it doing that?
So first of all, clearly everyone's earning capacity increases with the amount of formal education they have. And so somebody who doesn't complete high school is really consigned to a life of minimum wage jobs, unless they can complete high school, which then becomes their entry ticket to technical education and so forth. And Bill Clinton even started this conversation 20-some years ago, where he said that we really need to be thinking about 13th grade and 14th grade, that in order to be really successful and to be on a firm footing, that people need at least a 2-year post-secondary education, whether that's job training or whether it's the bridge to 4-year college degrees. And we see, in terms of Tricia's story, we're seeing more and more of that in higher education. Community colleges and technical colleges have always had a really vibrant, non-traditional population where they've, confronted a lot of parenting students. But all colleges and universities in the country are facing some enrollment challenges because 20 years ago there was a decline in the birth rate. So for us to recruit students and to grow, we need to look beyond the traditional 18 to 22-year-olds. So who are those people? Well, they're 35-year-old divorcees who have children, who might have started college and dropped out because life got in the way, and now they want to come back and finish their degrees. They want to come back and get that graduate degree that they had always dreamed about. And we need to be more nimble and more flexible in order to be able to accommodate the people who are doing a lot of different things.
Okay, so Mr. Teacher of the Year, when we talk about education, James, I know you have an opinion on this. So, how do we clear the barriers away and allow school systems, institutionalized school systems, to be able to pivot enough to meet this need, to be flexible, to think this way?
One of the things I think we have to acknowledge is that schools have not done a very good job of deconcentrating pockets of poverty, right? So that
is that up to them?
To an extent, school districts, shall we say, school systems. To an extent, we know that family status has an impact on the achievement levels of students. Not to say that poor kids can't learn, because I will absolutely refute that to anybody. But that has an impact, right? It's the baggage of poverty. Independent of that is the effect of concentrating low SES kids in the same environment. You will overwhelm that system with needs that really are non-academic. And so being responsible enough to say, okay, well, we need to do something to create an environment that addresses all of the other needs that are present in the school system and allows us to key in on academics while acknowledging some of the other baggage that comes along with that, I think is huge. In addition to that, after they get out of high school, we need to direct them to careers early. I think we've oversold college. College is great. I went, had a great time. But at the end of the day, it's about being able to provide a living for yourself by savoring means, and then lowering barriers. College is becoming extremely expensive as it currently stands, and people are getting saddled with all sorts of debt that it takes them years to pay off. In order to be able to pivot, in order to be more nimble in a sector with the majority of jobs that are growing are mid-skill and high-skill jobs that pay a living wage, you got to provide a pathway for folks to get there.
So how does financial literacy play into all this? Financial wellness, understanding money and how you allocate it?
Well, James gave a big example there. Kids do not understand that they're going into so much debt in college, and then when they get out, it's a horrible thing to have to pay back and do all the other things that you want to do. So again, we need to start with financial literacy early in school, and teach the dangers of credit card debt, teach the advantages of saving, teach how to manage your finances. So I think it's critically important to this overall topic of economic mobility.
Is there more than just talk about financial literacy that's going on? I mean, as we all recognize that it is. Tricia, is there some kind of movement going on in these families and in these schools? I
think there is in South Carolina. As a matter of fact, I was interviewing somebody yesterday. She just graduated from college, and she said, I didn't want to go to 13th grade, but I wanted to go to school. I got a scholarship, I worked 2 jobs, and I graduated in my 4 years out. But she said, I believe wholeheartedly that in high school we should be teaching personal finance. She said, watching how people and my friends spend money and the debt that they're going into is phenomenal. So that's just at the college level. The basic aspect of budgeting and even having $1,000 or $500, we talked about this in the green room, in the bank for those, when the tire goes out. We have another family we're working with, and it's a constant wave of you're up, you're down, you're up, you're down, because they don't have at least that cash sitting there to help them. So I think that's a huge piece of it, and we have several groups coming together to talk about that and put a statewide plan together. We're actually working with DHHS to help work with the Medicaid population on budgeting and financial wellness.
Is wage inflation the answer? Wage increases?
Well, no, not necessarily, because of course, Econ 101 would say that if you increase, you print more money, you end up with inflation. If you simply raise wages, then there's more money that's floating around and prices are going to go up as well. So increasing wages alone may not lead to increased buying power, which is really what we're talking about here, is the ability to have enough dollars to be able to meet your human needs and take care of your family. On the issue of financial literacy, Winthrop University has received an external grant where we then have an online program that all of our students go through to learn the basics of financial literacy, to understand the impact of the student loans that they're taking out, and to talk about making informed choices about, you know, how to be successful in college, but then also how to manage their money. And it has been very important because you know, we have a lot of low-income students who are coming, especially to public institutions in both of our states, and those students especially, I think, need that kind of instruction.
And Chris,
Please.
before we leave the issue of wages, I've got to talk about the minimum wage. And while you cannot make a living on $7.25 an hour, we, as a believer in the free enterprise system, we cannot mandate that minimum wage go up to $15 an hour that's been talked about in some parts of the country. That would have unintended consequences, in my opinion, with companies like restaurants looking for more computerized services. They will find ways to replace those workers.
To work around that.
And there are people who need those jobs at $7.25.
I'd have to respectfully disagree. I think that, to your point, I think that there's a combination of things that can happen. In North Carolina, we know that we cannot set a minimum wage, right? We are, you know, not a home rule state. That being said, I think there are tremendous companies out there who have experienced tremendous growth at the top of the pyramid, right, while wages have remained stagnant. So I think that there's enough money there to be able to pay a livable wage, while at the same time making more livable wage jobs available, right? So in other words, there's an amount of human capital you have to bring to the table in order to really possess the jobs that pay and allow you to mobilize yourself upwards. But I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all or a magic bullet thing. But poverty wages will continue to create a very permanent-looking underclass that we're experiencing now. And it's not a matter of whether folks are willing to work hard. I can tell you that right now, because when you're working 2 jobs to be able to make ends meet, clearly work ethic is not the issue. But it's the fact that inequality that we experience is something that, although I'm a fan of free enterprise to a degree, I think that wage floors are important.
You know what was interesting? In the dead heat of the summer of 2014, and some of you probably know this, the Brookings Institution released a study on those metros in the United States that had the greatest growth of concentrated poverty. And of the 10 metros, 40% were in the Carolinas. Greenville, South Carolina, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and Charlotte. And what I found interesting about that is those metros are the ones that also propose to be and hold themselves out to be the most progressive in growth in the New South. So I guess the question is, how do you square that kind of concentrated poverty growth with that kind of progressiveness? And that's an open question. And don't look at just Jamie.
Can I add as a caveat?
Yeah, please.
That's interesting. I didn't know that factoid. But if you look at the heat map that was produced in the Chetty study in 2014, you cannot not notice the fact that the entire Southeast is pretty red hot. Right, so that's a southern regional issue. Yeah, for intractable poverty and lack of economic mobility. So that's something that also has to be mentioned, is that although we talk about Charlotte as being dead last, 50th out of 50, the Southeast generally
according
is
to the Harvard study?
Yes. Yeah.
Tricia, how would you square those two types of, you know, the tale of two cities almost?
I think there's probably 10 or 15 factors that play into that, and that's the hard part about it. There's from, Greenville being a mecca, but it's also very close to Pickens, Anderson, all of those rural counties where people may live because that's where the housing is cheapest for them to live, but then traveling in car and a variety of reasons. You know, if I drive all the way in, for my $7 an hour job, I'm eating it up in transportation cost, or if I have to take the bus, if that's even available in that area. It's being eat up in some of those aspects, so that skilled labor, that education attainment might be that next level that's going to get me to where I need to be so I can bridge that gap.
I was also thinking that when you're talking about concentration of poverty, you mentioned core cities, right? Not you didn't mention the metro areas.
Right.
So the people who have the resources and the skills can move to the suburbs, which often have better school districts. They can manage the commutes, you know, they can find the housing that they like. And the people who lack resources are also the ones who lack that ability to move. So I can see that you would end up with this economic bifurcation that is often overlaid with, frankly, racial. You know, racial segregation.
We've got a minute left, and I want to read a quote for you, James, and I'd like you to respond to it. Gary McFadden, Detective Gary McFadden, at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Force, retired now, said we cannot have just events. We have to have some successes. And he said when he was a detective for 35 years, it was hand-to-hand combat in a nice way, but he was down facing people, engaging with people. Is that the secret weapon here?
I think that, again, I think if we're looking for magic bullets, we're going to be looking for a very long time. But I have to agree with GMAC on that point. I think that, you know, the times in which you knew the police officers on your beat, you know, when folks were walking on foot, when they had rapport, when they came from within the community, makes it very difficult to have negative police relations. Not that you haven't had police brutality and things. Those things have been around for decades, frankly. But I think that when you look at the things that cause crime, a lot of it has to do with all the economic mobility pieces, but then a lack of community, right?
Okay.
Trace community.
That's the last one. Thank you. Thank you. That'll be the last word. Tricia, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely, thank you.
James, good to see you. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Sue, always nice to see you. Karen, thank you.
Thank you.
Until next week. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, Bearings, Grant Thornton, Novant Health, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.